Okay. Welcome. I know there's a snowstorm out there, so attendance might be sparse today, but I'm grateful that you guys have made it here today to be present. Thus begins our talk. The last two talks were actually pretty good because we were talking about, and I started filming a lot of this content. So I mean, if you guys want to stick around afterwards, and I'll speak about it later, but I'll make sure to construct a mailing list, and then I'll send you guys all the videos of the conversations in the past, so that you guys can watch it and internalize it if you need to, right? So for today's topic, well, I'll start off with this idea, right? This challenge for you. Also, I don't know how far removed you guys are from math, right? I made a little math problem. It's very, very simple. 2 minus negative 3. So the answer to that is actually 5, okay? 2 minus negative 3 is 5, okay? But the question is, and very few adults, even math teachers, don't know the answer to this question, which is, why is it that when you subtract a negative, you end up with a positive, right? Thus begins my lecture, which is this, right? So Buddhism, in a nutshell, one of the many things about it is really about attaining wisdom, right? Because the more that you cultivate yourself, the more that you sit here with lectures, you're attaining wisdom, right? Now, implied in that statement is that you are, to some extent, like filling your cup of knowledge, right? And adding to that pool of knowledge, and thus you become wiser, right? What if I told you that that's actually not true at all, right? And that Buddhism is actually quite the opposite of that. It's the place and the refuge, the place where you go to actively learn, to unlearn, right? That's a fascinating notion that people don't think about. So I want to obviously go through why, right? But what I have here is that, like, through your own personal experience growing up, and through society, and through the media, right? Each step along the way, something has taught you something, right? And to some extent, any singular experience can color your perception of the whole world, okay? And all perceptions, to some extent, is an illusion of actual reality, right? And just like for semantics sake, right? They wouldn't call perception a perception, and they wouldn't call reality a reality if they weren't two different things to begin with, right? But because we are all human, and we see through our own eyes, and we all have unique experiences growing up and getting us here to this present moment, we each have perception. Like, not a singular person can claim that they have a version of reality. That's not possible, right? Just based on how humans function, okay? So the question becomes, why do we have to unlearn what we have learned, right? And in order for us to even understand this concept, I'm going to have to build it up via an analogy, okay? So here's the analogy. I'm sure you guys have been in like very big crowds in the past, like, concert, whatever, an audience of something, right? And usually the MC goes up there and would say something like, do we have any Brooklyn folks in the house? And then the people will like cheer, oh, like people from the Bronx, great, yeah, Queens, great. Or, depending on the function, right? Anybody from New York here? Woo, okay, great, right? People get excited when they are being represented, right? Whether it's like their countries are being represented, being shouted out, or like even like their alma mater, like, anybody, who went to CUNY, like, give it a shout out, great. Or even sports team, right? Sports team. And so what's happening in that very micro moment when the MC's shouting people out, right? You see people get really excited, really passionate because they're being represented, right? But it's interesting too, because it's very telling. Passion, or too much passion, represents something, And this is something that Buddhism is trying to steer us away from, which is being too overly attached to things, to things that define your identity, right? Where you come from, your age, sex, gender identity, alma mater, whatever else, right? To some extent, if you become too attached to it, that becomes an issue. And this is the idea that Buddhism is trying to push for, which is how can we challenge you to unlearn and not be too attached to these things, right? Because with every event, emotion, etc., there's always two realities, right? There's one side of the coin and the other side of the coin, right? What happens to those people who are too attached to something, too passionate about something, right? So the answer is that sometimes attachment to like any concepts become a tool for judgment and a tool for attacking the other side, right? And so two things end up happening, which is that, or two major things anyway. All of a sudden, right, when you become attached to a singular concept or identity, it becomes an us versus them, right? And there's a lot of power in language, especially when you put or create a language, or you put a language that actually creates this dynamic of us versus them, an in-group versus an out-group. Via just mere language, the first, if you say, oh yeah, us Buddhists, right? Even then, even saying that, forces a definition in which we define ourselves, and then thus the in-group, and then everybody else is the out-group. There's either Buddhists or non-Buddhists. They're either Christians or non-Christians, Muslims or non-Muslims, right? And so that's very interesting in that sense, right? Especially when I'll get to that, right? And so what's the issue with actually creating two different groups, right? Because part of the in-group bias that gets created is that our brains and our minds say, oh man, we are so filled with complexity and nuance and depth, like this group. And then guess what happens to the other side, the out group? Quite the opposite effect. They get simplified, right? And they get lumped into one group, one hulking, I would say, stereotype, okay? And that happens with everything. Even when you think about like the most basic dynamic, males versus females, right? Us males, da-da-da-da-da-da. Those females, and vice versa. Us females and those males, right? Notice how even in creating that type of language, it becomes the basis for judgment. It becomes the basis for attacking and so on and so forth, right? And I thought about this idea specifically because, and this is a side story, right? So I'm a teacher, or I work at a high school, and I was speaking to this other teacher, and she started to refer to, us teachers and then admin. And I'm like, wait a minute. Admin? There's only an assistant principal and principal. But instead of referring to, I guess that there is a need for language in referring to that, but the way that she was saying it with such, such conviction, but such use of division, right? It made it seem like an us versus them scenario. It's like teachers versus admin. When we come from the same school, we're working towards the same goal and purpose of helping kids. Why is it necessarily teachers versus, it's the same thing with in-group fighting, right? When there's a war out there, all of a sudden you really don't care about the division between yourself and your neighbors. You care about the war and handling the real business out there, right? If we were suddenly attacked by another country like Russia or something, right? And so I just thought about that. I'm like, wait a minute. Why all of a sudden this type of, why draw a line in the sand? why separate us, right? Because when you do that, you create a lot of judgment, a lot of assumptions, and you create a lot of narratives about the other side. And to some extent, othering, right, is detrimental to progress, okay? And here's the thing. Even if we are like deeply aware of ourselves, our thoughts, words, and actions, there are things that are always outside of our consciousness, right? It's subconscious, which is right outside of our consciousness, right? And there are things that society has taught us that we certainly aren't even aware of, right? But we just assume it to be true, right? So cultural truisms are defined as such, where it's like widely held, but rarely questioned, okay? And so a lot of doing the work is asking yourselves, like, what are some things that I hold on to deeply, and I'm attached to, but I never even question, okay? And to some extent, the idea is this. It's not our fault, right? Like every news article that comes across your face, every social media swipe, every interaction with a colleague, every random interaction on the street, every lecture that you hear, you're gaining information. You're filling your information up, right? But this type of information, if you're not aware of it, is either it's reinforcing a certain belief that you may have, and you've never had the chance to challenge that belief, okay? And so it could be like either a positive belief towards something, positive stereotype, and or a negative belief towards something, a negative stereotype, okay? And so I'm going to make a random transition because it's apt and it's applicable to today, right? And today is Sunday. Do you guys know what particular day of Sunday it is in the sports world?
Some game.
Some game, yes, that's the attitude. No, it's Super Bowl Sunday, right? It's Super Bowl Sunday. Now, yes, well, there's lots, there's a spectrum of people in this world, right? Those that are like passionate, diehard fans. And there are people who are just like, oh, it's just a game, right? Now, I actually put this into the lecture because at the end of the day, right? And I'll actually get to that in a second. But it's the Chiefs, Kansas City Chiefs versus the Philadelphia Eagles, right? Now, if you ever watch, if you decided to turn on today, or even like, in your recollection of like fans in general, right? You ever notice how in the stands, they're like, obviously like cheering, like, some of them are like taking off their shirts and the howling and stuff like that, right? And at some point, because they are cheering for their team, right? It's creating a sort of like in-group bias, right? And also it creates a lot of like what they call group polarization, where your thoughts and your actions become a little bit more extreme when you're around your people, right? And what's interesting is people don't realize it, but at first it starts off benign. You start off first cheering for your team, but what it ends up devolving into is then you start booing the other team, right? It becomes a form of attack as well, which is really fascinating. And so you become an active participant in not only, like, obviously trying to uplift your group, but simultaneously push down the other group. Wow, that's A. The second thing is this, right? Either fans, the Chiefs or the Eagles, they're going to be passionate. And there's a tagline or a general statement, which is the thrills of victory and the agonies of defeat, right? If you're extremely passionate and extremely attached, somebody's going to be suffering something out there, right? Whereas if you're really not attached to it, you say, oh, it's going to be a football game. Great. What if one team wins or lose? There's no strong emotion behind it. Who's suffering? The person who's like not so attached? I mean, they'll watch it. Or the person who's like, yes, my team's got to win. At the end of the day, this is the idea of, and this is harking back to my previous lecture, which is it's okay to have strong beliefs as long as they are loosely held, right? the people who hold on to their beliefs so much, when they encounter an environment or a reality that's different from what they expect, they're in for a world of suffering. And the middle path with regards to Buddhism refers to the middle path because the middle path is be in it, but be out of it at the same time, right? You can really enjoy it, but also simultaneously not be so attached. And therefore, you're not going to experience that needless form of suffering, okay? So, coming back to this discussion, when people hold prejudice, right, and that's what it is, prejudice towards a rival group, they're willing to do whatever it takes to elevate their group and also to undermine their rivals. That's always the case, right? And it could be as benign as, saying like us males versus those females, or us females versus those males, right? There's a simplification process that's happening, right? And so the question becomes, how do we avoid this, right? How do we get people from opposite sides of the spectrum to come to the middle, right? It kind of sounds familiar, right? The middle, Isn't this the middle path that the Buddha has been talking about for so long, for thousands of years, right? And so there's this psychologist, his name is Adam Grant. He's done research and experiments on this. And he's done several experiments to see, like, how can we get two sides that hates each other? Because, look, in this world, there's plenty of hot button topics that people are really, really passionate about, right? For example, abortion, one way or the other. But something, or war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Republicans versus Democrats. There's so many, difference in opinions, right? Even sports team, right? New York Yankees, New York Mets, Boston Red Sox, there's fierce rivalry everywhere. How do we get those two sides to ever come together? Okay? So, 3 experiments were conducted. First one, get people to see their commonalities. Instead of saying, you females, us males, say, we humans. Do you guys think that's effective or ineffective? Research has shown it's barely effective, right? Even if they put somebody who's injured, right? Let's just say an injured Yankees fan in a Boston Red Sox stadium. They may, if they were taught we're all humans, whatever, the other side may help them, but not much, okay? So it's actually not that effective to speak to our commonalities. So option 2, getting people to know the individual. So for example, if I hold a certain stereotype or certain judgment about the other side, getting them to have one-on-one conversations to get to know the other side. What they found was that it's also a very tiny amount of influence and effectiveness. Why is that? Well, basically you say, okay, let's just say I make some random funny claim all females. I want to say something so silly and out, but this is just for the sake of example, right? Let's just say I say all females don't know how to plan or manage their money, right? Because throughout my whole experience, I've met people who just didn't know how to manage their money. Let's just say I'm saying I don't believe it; it's not true, but it's okay. But then I happen to meet a financial planner who happens to be female, and she knows way more than me about how to plan money, right? Would that actually change my perception of all female?
Maybe not.
And therein is the problem. I'll make the exception to that one financial manager that I know, but then I'll say in my head, and this is how human psychology works, they'll say, oh, okay, she might be the exception to the rule, but the rule still stands. They're all bad at managing money, right? So apparently that's not effective either. So appealing to people's commonality doesn't work. And appealing to getting people to meet one-on-one doesn't work either, okay? So the question is, what is the one thing that allows us to actually consider letting go of our attachment to our strong beliefs about certain things and our strong attachment to concepts. What they found was that the most important thing that allows us to dismantle our stereotypes and even attachment to these stereotypes is to get people to think about the arbitrariness of their animosity. What does that refer to? Let's think about being a random sports fan, all right? Let's just say Yankees and Red Sox, right? They don't like each other at all. But how you became a Yankees fan is completely arbitrary. How you became a Red Sox fan is completely arbitrary depending upon where you were born. And this goes with religion as well, right? Whether you were raised up Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, whatever, it's completely arbitrary. So why is there so much hatred towards one group or the other group when it's simply by chance that you were born that way? You were born into a specific thing, and then your life history has led you to this present moment where you happen to represent this idea, right? And so what they found is that everyone in this world, like everything that we're passionate about, has arrived to us by chance based on our experiences. So why hold on to these biases, these stereotypes with such strong conviction when you realize, when you think about the people who hold on to it the most, A, suffer the most, but B, they've arrived there by chance. And just as we have arrived here by chance to be in this very room, to receive this lecture, it's completely, to some extent, arbitrary and by chance. Sure, there is like some amount of choice that you have made to arrive here, right? But even ending up in New York City, in the Bronx, maybe somewhere along the way in your 20s, you guys ended up in Texas. And this lecture, you guys would never have been privy to this lecture, right? And so, what is this conversation doing? When two sides from opposite sports team, rivals, learn that on a meta level, that like they happen to be fierce rivals for no reason at all, they're able to actually detach and let go of the animosity that fuels the rivalry, right? Because they realize, oh, okay, he's a avid Yankees fan, but it's okay because that's his life experience that has led him here. So I don't have to outwardly dislike him if I certainly understand this concept that it's completely arbitrary, right? Because the reality is, in a parallel universe, the Yankees fan could have been the Boston Red Sox fan, and vice versa. You could have been male, or you could have been female, right? You could have been Asian, or Hispanic, or anything else in between, right? And so even being in this world, having that religion, completely arbitrary. So that's like, to some extent, the conclusion of this lecture. And I want to go back to the initial piece. And actually, I'll go back to the math equation as well, right? The key idea is this. When you are able to reflect on how arbitrary some of our beliefs that we hold deeply are, you're able to actually let it go. And when you are able to let go of your strong convictions, it's one step towards the end of suffering. And when you think about the people who suffer deeply, 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 it's because they believe in something and hold on to it for so long, despite the evidence around it, okay? And so, learning to let go is ultimately how you gain wisdom. Wisdom is not about learning more concepts and gaining more experiences and stuff. It's actually about learning to let go of these things. Let go of some of your convictions, right? And arrive at the middle ground where you could still hold on to it. You could still have it, but not hold on to it. That's what the middle path is really about. And so at the beginning, right, I asked the math question, which is, what's 2 minus -3, right? And for the young kids in the back, 2 minus -3 is what? 5, great. Why is it that when you subtract a negative, you get a positive? No math teacher has ever taught you guys this, right?
That's the same thing I was thinking. I was like, why did I question that?
Right.
Why is that rule? Is the 3 letting go?
Well, yes. Here's how I explain it to kids. Ready? I mean, you could think about it in terms of money, but whatever. Think about it as you are holding onto a balloon, 2 balloons that's trying to pick you up into the sky, right? Like these 2 balloons are trying to pick you up in the sky. But what's on your legs? 3 weights. 3-pound weights. 1 pound, 2 pound, 3 pounds. When you let go of these pounds, guess what? You're moving up to the next level, right? So when you subtract a negative, it becomes a positive, right? You're moving up. It's a visualization idea, but that's something for you guys worth understanding, right? So, in conclusion, right? There's an importance to unlearning things to avoid being ignorant, right? And when you think about it, that's what wisdom is. It's the opposite of ignorance. It's not being ignorant. But oftentimes, we have such widely held beliefs and we never question them. And a lot of Buddhism is challenging us to question the things that we see, question our perception of reality, and to say, maybe our perception is not true, right? And to even possibly perceive it as an illusion. And when you are able to do so, you're able to not be too attached to it. Over-attachment to anything creates suffering, and so the end of suffering has to be somewhere along the line of walking towards the middle path, right? Simultaneously being in and out of it. So, in the end, don't cheer too hard for one team, otherwise you're going to be in for a world suffering. Okay, that's my conclusion for today. Thank you so much. That's it. Yeah. All right, thank you.